Today, kids, we're going to talk about probably the most common tactic in chess. It's called a pin. You know, like when your teacher pins an assignment to the board? Well, today, a pin is when two of the other team's pieces are in the same line. Take a look at Mr. King and Mr. Knight. They're on the same diagonal, and lucky for us, our bishop is on that diagonal. Now, what does a pin do? Well, it keeps the other person's piece from running away. In this chess position, if this knight tries to run away, the black king will be in check. That's against the rules, so we say the knight is pinned. If I try to move the knight, you're going to see the computer won't even let me do it. Since moving the knight is against the rules, we call it an absolute pin. It's absolutely not able to move, because the piece behind it would be the king. And we all know by now, it's against the rules to put your king in check. Do you see another absolute pin that white is doing to the black pieces? Well, that would be the rook. Notice the king and the rook are also on the same diagonal, and, lucky for us, our queen's on that diagonal too. So this rook is absolutely pinned. He is stuck. Oh, no. He's like a wrestler when somebody else jumps on top of him. He's stuck to the mat. Here's your challenge, kids. I want you to make a pin. How about using the king and the queen? Pause your videos and figure out how white can do that. Well, here you actually had two answers. You could have used either rook, so it's dealer's choice. Let's go ahead and pick this rook, moving the rook to e1. Notice we're putting our rook on the same line as the two black pieces. This queen is absolutely pinned. If she runs away, she'd be putting her own king in check. That's against the rules. And of course, white has a backup. If the queen takes the rook, we have this other rook that'll swoop over, and white is very happy to trade a rook for a queen. And you know by now, the queen is worth 9 points, the rook is only 5. That's a deal I'll make every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Next position. Okay, I'm going to ask you to find another pin in this position. Pause your videos and have white play a dynamite move. Okay, you actually have to focus on the other person's pieces first. The king and the rook are on the same diagonal. We have a diagonal moving piece. That would be the bishop. The bishop travels up to h5, and this is very similar to the pin in the first position. If the rook tries to run away, that's against the rules. The computer won't even let me do it. Now the best try for black is to move his king to the square f7. I know it's tempting to capture that rook, but sometimes you've got to be a little bit more patient. Hold your horses, as some of my chess teachers say. If the bishop captures the rook, I know you're winning 5 points for 3, but white only has one pawn left, and if the black king can step in front of it, you're going to have to take my word for it. That's a draw. Let's go back. White had a better move here. Boys and girls, when you already have a pinned piece, you want to put pressure on the pinned piece. You're going to hear me say that in a lot of videos. I'm going to shorten it. Put PP on the PP. Put pressure on the pinned piece. I want you to pile up on that rook because he's stuck. We only have one piece we can do that with. That's our pawn. So our pawn lurches forward. The rook can't move. So black has to make a different move. And now when we capture the rook, the bishop has the backup of the pawn. This is a winning position. So boys and girls, don't always capture the pinned piece. Sometimes you want to put pressure on it. Next chess position. Now, white is in a pin, but this is not an absolute pin. We call this a relative pin. What that means is the knight usually shouldn't move, but it's not against the rules. When a piece is in a relative pin, there's a piece behind the pinned piece that's not a king, in this case a queen. Moving the knight is usually bad. If I move the knight to d4, I'm going to lose my queen. But that's not against the rules. You are allowed to give away your queen. Let's go back. There was a couple of ways that white could have gotten out of the pin. That's what we're going to focus on here. The coolest move for white is knight to g5 check. Notice the power of check. Because black's king is in danger, he doesn't have time to take our queen. That's a very important difference. So the black king scoots out of the way. Not only does white get to save his queen, he gets to win a piece. She just comes up the board and captures the bishop. Let's go back. There's another common way to get out of a pin. In this position, you can advance your pawn to h3, and if the bishop tries to go to h5, To keep the pin, white can play this cool move g4, and the pin is now blocked. In fact, the bishop is trapped. So white went from a pinned knight to winning a piece. That's a pretty good turnaround. I've got one more position I want to look at today. In this position, what I want to show you is that when a piece is pinned, it's not doing the job that it looks like it's doing. Let's start off by figuring out which one of black's pieces is pinned. Well, it's not that easy to see. You have to look at the entire board. It's this pawn. Did you notice this bishop coming all the way down the diagonal and pinning the pawn? That pawn is in an absolute pin. The reason we call it absolute is because the piece behind it is the king, so it's absolutely not able to move. Even though it looks like this pawn is guarding the other pawn, what you have to remind yourself is that a pinned piece does not protect. And our queen can travel all the way up the board and capture this pawn. It looks like a bad move, but remember the pawn can't take, it's in an absolute pin. The king has to scoot sideways, and now we get to play our favorite checkmate, the queen and helper mate, which I know you already know about. The queen sits on top of the king, the bishop is the helper, and because we know about pins, we're able to execute a checkmate. Let's review the key ideas. When two of the other team's pieces are on the same line, look to make a pin. Your queen, your bishop, and your rook can all make pins. If a piece is pinned to the king, it's an absolute pin. Otherwise, it's a relative pin. Just because you're in a pin doesn't mean you can't get out. And also, when a piece is pinned, it's not doing the job that it looks like it's doing. Oh, and don't forget, put PP on the PP and you'll be the pin master.